All right, is that working okay? Can you hear me okay? I can't tell where I'm at. All right, good. So nice to be with you, really. Just on a personal level, saw a Ute shirt in the audience. Happy to see that. I love BYU. I love both. When they play, I wear gray. I bring in my seat, so I have some Ute fans with me, some BYU fans, but all the BYU fans were screaming at us this past year. I don't cheer for either when they play. I just enjoy the game. So just before we get into it, a couple quick thoughts. I'm as connected to devices as you are, and it's not like a demand, but I prefer in these settings to talk about personal things. I feel like, so much for me started here on BYU campus. I met my co-founders here. I met my wife here. We built our business here. Had professors who sacrificed time, and so it's personal. And I just feel like the personal and the business have bled into one another beautifully for me at this stage of my life. So I'm willing to get personal and a little bit vulnerable. It's easier to do that if there are fewer or no devices. If that's how you take notes, fine. My slides are deliberately, they're clean, they're easy to follow. There's not the note taking might be best just in your mind and maybe to connect on a more personal level. So if you're inclined, close your laptops, turn off your phone. If it works for you, I'm not going to beat you up for it. I get it. That's the first thing. Second is I enjoy in these settings. I really look forward to this. I enjoy in these settings engaging with you, and I know sometimes maybe it's this time of day. For me, this time of day is when I get a little tired, need some Zip Fizz or a Coke Zero or something to just give me a little bit of whatever. You guys give me that, but if I'm sitting in your seat and sitting down, I'd get tired. So I brought my favorite books, a handful of them. I think I have 10. If you ask a question, I'll pause. I have 4 sections I want to talk about. I'll pause, and if you ask a question, you get a book. Or if you're wearing a Ute shirt, you might get a book. I better be careful or I'm going to create enemies here. So anyway, please engage. There will be time for more Q&A, but I hope that at each sort of chunk here that I've chunked out, that you feel free to ask questions, and maybe it can make it more helpful for the whole group. The topic and what I thought is, I was asked to speak about this a year, maybe 2 years ago, and it caused me some thought. Can you talk about wholehearted risk? And the first thing that came to mind when I think about wholehearted risk is something a little bit different than straight entrepreneurship. Let's see if I can get this to work. So this is not my grandfather, but this is representative for me of my grandfather. So my grandfather, his family came from Mexico. He first was in El Paso, Texas, and after the 2nd grade, he dropped out of school. I'm named after him. His name was Sidronio. I'm Sidney, the sort of Americanized version of that. Sidronio Sembrano. And he came to El Paso, Texas, and after the 2nd grade, dropped out of school to turn bricks in a brick factory for 50 cents a day to help the family. He had a wealthy uncle who was like, you need to stay in school, I'll pay for your school, but it was important to him and his parents that he help. And so when I think of real risk, now my grandfather was one who years later, they moved to LA where I was born, and I remember him reading the newspaper front to back. 2nd grade education, but he would read that newspaper. And back in the day, you may not have really known big newspapers, but they were big, and there was a lot of reading. He would read it front to back. He would have his bag of nickels from his gambling in Vegas. He was a devout Catholic. He was not LDS, so maybe some of his pastimes were a little different than ours, but he would have his bag of nickels from Vegas. He would give me nickels for all my A's on my report card, and motivated me as kind of an influence in my life to do my best. When I think of real risk and wholehearted risk, I think of stuff like that. So I don't want to be so presumptuous. In my industry, in whether you're starting a startup or in venture capital, we talk about what we do, and we too often use war terms. And it's kind of weird. We're not in the trenches. There are real people who've served in trenches. We're not giving it all, though we may be financially giving it all. I was at that stage. There are people who give different things. So that's what I think of when I think of wholehearted risk. That said, I'm convinced that whether it's an entrepreneur giving their all and putting it all on the line financially, or whether it's my 4-year-old boy playing with his Legos and losing the Superman piece, which he did the other day, and crying inconsolably about his lost Superman, that it feels real. And that's what I want to share with you is, my notion of wholehearted risk was and is real for me. If I can get this to work. Maybe not. There we go. So I'm going to talk about it in the context of my startup. I'm going to take you through the journey of when we began, me and my co-founders, kind of setting sail. I'm going to take you through when we started to scale and what a growing team meant for us and the risks associated and how I view them now. I'm going to take you through IPO, actually first acquisition / IPO and what some of the risks there taught me. And then I'll take you through kind of today as a venture capitalist, full-time investing in startups, kind of how I think about wholehearted risk, all right? Maybe I'll just have to cue you up. Okay. So the first piece of this is initially when I thought about wholehearted risk, I thought about it in terms of problems worth putting my whole heart into. So me and my co-founders, one of them I had started a startup with before. It was our fourth together, and the first one took us to Detroit. And is anybody from the Midwest or Michigan by chance? Where are you from? Minnesota. All right. We were in Detroit, and I like to play basketball. I played in a pickup league in the city, and I befriended a young man who to this day is a good friend. And from him, learned that the context for going to college is really different based on your background. Neither side of his family had ever gone to college. There was not a father around. His brother was in prison for crack. His sister was having, I think, her second child. She was 15 years old, out of wedlock, and it was just a tougher circumstance than I had grown up with. And so we're moving back to Utah from Michigan. Coming back, I wanted to finish my degree, so I dropped out of school for my first startup. And I say, hey, Marv, come back with me. Let me help you think about college. And so he decided to, kind of reluctantly, helped him apply to UVU. And that process was one that was just mind-blowing to me, how difficult it was, how hard, especially if you're a person who didn't come from parents who had gone to college, how it could be very daunting. Ironically, how a school like UVU or BYU would love to have people from different places, different backgrounds, different colors, different experiences, but how impossible it seems for them to reach those people. This became, in other words, a big problem in my mind. Why is this so hard? And it's like the biggest decision we make where we're going to go to school. So I remember he got in. I remember he called me one day. He's at that, if you've been to UVU, you know that hall with all the flags. It feels like a high school hallway. Every time I walk down, even now, I'm like, zipper up, am I breath? How do I look? Because you feel a little self-conscious. He felt that way this day. He called me and he's like, yo, Sid, he's like, I think I'm the only black person in this whole school. And I'm like, you might be. Just breathe, breathe, and you're going to be all right. He teaches school now locally, is a good friend, and I'm grateful that he helped me understand this. So we get into this, me and Mike. If you could advance the slide, if you don't mind. We start this company Zinch, and the idea was that most students, it turns out, are recruited based on their test score. They take the ACT or SAT, and that's where the process begins. And if you think back to high school, which isn't too long ago for you, and you can remember all the things you get in the mail, like these fancy brochures, some of the schools you know, some of the schools you don't. So we start with this idea of I am more than a test score. There's got to be more to show about yourself than a test score, certainly, but students just had no idea that that's how schools are recruiting them. And so we start this company. Next slide. And this is us. We get going. We're these young bucks. I'm the guy in the middle. We all have beards now. It's funny. We're entering into our midlife crisis. And I was just with they live in London now. These are my co-founders, Brad and Mick. I was just with Brad. He was in town for a little bit, schooling me down on his latest thing, which is blockchain technologies and cryptocurrency. I'm sure there's a handful of you that own different coins right now, which I think is cool. And so we're off to the races. We feel like we're on top of the world. And you even look at us in this picture, and it's like we're kind of smug. We think we're like these startup somethings. Well, that excitement and all that energy of this big problem, and I'm with my boys, and we're doing our thing in downtown Provo, and we're going to be something special. It came, for me, next slide, to a screeching halt. Nope, not yet. Back one. That's okay. when my brother passed away. So after we raised our first round of funding, my brother tragically passed away. He was 23, I'm 27 at the time. And all of a sudden, my life just got really simple. And I remember we were in the home of, just up the hill here in Oak Hills, a friend named Ryan Caldwell. He's the CEO of a company called MX, if you've heard of it. And I'm just despondent, and I'm like, guys, I'm done. I didn't have my equity. Like, I've got a hole in my heart. Nothing, seems that important to me, other than my family and someone who I loved, who I lost. And I remember it was Brad, so I've kind of zoomed into me and Brad here, because I remember Brad, who I was with just this morning, looks at me and he says, hang on, man, like, we're here for you, we're not going anywhere, and take the time you need. Had that not gone that way, like, I don't want to say I wouldn't be standing in front of you today. Maybe I would have done something different, but I wouldn't have had the experience that was so fulfilling to me. And I'll share with you the journey we went through, for like just a few generations, from people coming and finding this great country to have like the full experience of the American dream. At least one aspect of it has been so fulfilling in many ways. So next slide. What I found was that wholehearted risk requires not just people, and problems. Transition to one more slide. Not just problems, but people worth putting your whole heart into. To this day, I met with two entrepreneurs this morning, talking to them about what they're working on, and it is so much about their founders. It is so much about their first few employees. It is so much about them and our ability to find a real and genuine connection, and somebody you can go arm in arm with as you kind of jump off the metaphorical cliff. Next slide. So we're building this company, and what we found is that team and that connection that we had between a few of us. Oh, wait, I'm going to pause. Questions with that first stage? Please. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. So let me give you, this is a book. This is a newer one. I'm a Tim Ferriss fan. I read when I was living in Beijing, The 4-Hour Workweek. It's a little aspects of it cheesy, but I really like Tim Ferriss. I listen to his podcast. This is his latest Tribe of Mentors. I find that there's a lot of nuggets. What he does in that book is he asks a series of the same questions to a bunch of successful people, and it's a great, quick reference, even though it looks really fat and onerous. It's a good kind of quick reference. So, I think, fortunately, for a lot of us, our shared faith and the experiences that go along with that, there's opportunities to learn to form connections. That was the case for me. So my co-founders, what you don't know is that one of them, we served in our missions together. We were at BYU together. I was in an econ, which is the hard early one. Is it 101 that's kind of the filter you out? Yeah. I remember being in that class when I was like, I can't do this anymore, and I wrote him this 3-page letter on something we should go leave, and that's when we dropped out of school for a time, and went and did our first startup. Those connections, I think, were just embedded in the experience of, from standing in front of people and giving a talk to, being in smaller settings, getting to know each other. But also, my first job, it was heavily in sales, and I found that, today, the only skill that I really have when I talk to the CEOs that I back and whose boards I serve on is in sales, but more specifically, and people are easy to write off sales, especially if you're not in sales. I find that sales can be a real craft, and it's taught me to read people, to get to know them, to connect with them, to see them. So many times if I'm with Scott, I can just be like, hey man, how are you? But it's different when, with Scott, somebody who I have a connection with, when I can say, how are you? And there's times where he's been in tears, and it's been hard, and there's times when I've been in tears. And when you have a friend or connections you can make at that level, that's what we need. What we need is each day somebody to look at us and say, how are you? And really look at us. We're not seen so often. We unintentionally hide behind some things. One more question. Anybody have one? Up in the back?
So when you talk about finding a problem, where can your whole heart into?
Yeah.
How did you identify that problem?
It was, yeah, so like I shared, this was just a personal experience from living in Detroit and happening to the orbit of my life intersected or moved into the orbit of another young man's life. This is a book, Seth Godin. I love Seth Godin's stuff. All marketers tell stories. I'm a big fan. So finding the problem is, let me share what I would share about this. So if I had a slide up here that talked about how do you know when a problem's big enough, one thing right now that it doesn't irk me, but it like only disappoints me, because I'm like, if you're going to put so much into something, why are you doing that? There's a lot of incremental gains to be had, and you can build good businesses based on a marginal improvement in an existing concept. You have a piece of software that helps you organize your customers better than Salesforce or something else, and those pop up all the time. Sometimes you have ideas that are fundamentally different in that they don't exist, that you're going after. Those are the biggest opportunities. They also fail, most of them, but they're the biggest opportunities. You know, what I tell people is, and I'm writing something because one of our companies launches tomorrow. It's not the next B2B SaaS company. It's a rare consumer play in Utah. And I think it's the biggest swing I've ever seen. I'm writing a little post on it. I'm not like I don't publish a lot. I don't fancy myself, a real writer. But what I think is special about it is in Utah, we see a lot of these companies that, like Qualtrics or Pluralsight, or Domo's a little different because they raise so money so early, but companies that follow a B2B SaaS strategy where you start with a great product, and then you need to sell that product. You're usually selling a half-baked product. And then you ramp up marketing to be able to support your sales team. And then you move into branding and PR. In other words, you and I only hear about Qualtrics when Qualtrics, and this is true, is only like 5, 6, 7 years old. We only hear about Pluralsight in the last few years, where all of a sudden, like Aaron Skonnard seems to be on every other panel or giving a speech somewhere, because now Pluralsight is very much in the public eye. It's rare that we appreciate companies that are just out of inception, where we can appreciate kind of the fact that it's such a novel thing, because we see fewer consumer plays in Utah. That's a little bit longer than you wanted and maybe asked for, and I hope I'm not using too much jargon here. I might be, but what I would say is, when you have a chance to, when you see something that irks you, and if there's just a few other people that you think it affects, and if it doesn't exist at all, there's something special. As opposed to, one of my first investments was Podium. I feel like there's been already 10 competitors in Utah pop up, and I just look at it going, really? Like, they've already got massive category leadership. It's going to be really hard to nip at their heels. I get that you're saying, that's so easy, that's so straightforward. Yes, so is Google, But there's but it's hard sometimes to go in and fight an incumbent. I prefer to go into industries where there's nobody that exists. Anyway, so a little bit there. Let me jump to the next piece. Appreciate the question. As we were scaling the business, we found that kind of circle of trust began to extend beyond the founding team. And we had none more dramatic a hire, if you could advance to the next slide, than Ann Duane. Ann was an advisor of mine. Ann went to Georgetown for her undergrad. She grew up in the east/south. She went on to HBS. She worked for Paul Allen, like the Paul Allen. I know there's also a great Paul Allen that has ties to Utah, but the Paul Allen, and she did some cool stuff. She co-founded a company called military.com, which was the first website that connected veterans to opportunities. And so she seemed like a perfect fit. We're like, hey, we're connecting students to opportunities. And so Ann was living in San Francisco at the time. She'd been there a decade. And we're like, she's advising us, and we're like, what would you think about helping us scale in a bigger role, like coming in as our CEO? So we were smart enough as a group, next slide, to know that we had limitations. At this stage, our business was really starting to grow. It was outstripping our own capacity as founders, and the hard but honest decision you have to make sometimes as a founder is, who do I need to find that's smarter than me? Hopefully you do that sooner than later. And in some cases, it's who's even can be the chief executive of this business. So we approached Dan, and we're like selling her on Utah. We're like, Utah's great. Like, where do you live now, San Francisco? Oh, Utah's great. You're going to find all the opportunities and restaurants. And then like months later, so she agreed. Months later, I'm walking her through like married housing, not off of BYU. She's a single professional woman, grew up on the East Coast, like has only been in big cities, and she joined and she moved to Provo, Utah. You can believe that. There were days when she called me, and I won't share all of it, but I mean, she had some of those similar to Marvin's experience, like, oh my goodness, where am I? Like, why is everybody like this, and why am I so different? So Ann joined the team, and what it seemed like at first was we were taking huge risk on Ann. It's like, oh my goodness, like, most of the companies in Utah, especially back then and even now, it's like, we're all a bunch of guys. And so one, it's a gender dynamic that's brand new. She's way smarter than us. Like, I barely got my undergraduate degree, and she's gone to Harvard Business School, and those were mostly good things. But then there's the real things of like, are we going to get along? Is she going to be kind of be part of the tribe? And and then we started to see things differently. Like, so Ann joins, if you can transition to the next slide, and then we realized that the risk, like you start to examine this scenario and you're like, where was the real risk? Like Ann left a career in San Francisco where she's coming off an exit. Monster.com acquired her company and she was an SVP for them, which means she made a lot of money and she managed a lot of people and she had her pickings of her next gig. She's moving to Provo, from there. In your career progression, you don't usually say like Boston, San Francisco, Provo. Now, that's changed. I'm not an apologist for Provo or Utah. Like, I think it's one of the best places in the world to build. It was a little different, a little less awesome a decade ago. And so when we started to look at this, and you want to talk gender, like she's joining a company of mostly guys. Like if I can't, I look at it now and I think, how in the world did she do that? Fortunately for us, she joined, the business continued to scale, and we took the business to the next exciting place, which I'll share. But the point of this, if you can transition to the next slide, is that, oftentimes, I thought of this as wholehearted risk requires staying power that comes by taking risk in others, when in fact, if you can transition the slide, it's others taking risks in you. You quickly realize that. It moves this from, and hopefully the feel you're starting to get is it moves it from the whole world as an entrepreneur, you're trying to bend to your will, and yet inevitably and eventually you find that there's, it's not as simple as you're the center of this universe. There's another universe or parallel universes, that you're operating with. Let me pause to take a couple questions. Right here. Yes.
So, man, right?
Yeah.
Like, at what point did you decide that it was necessary to come on? Like, what kind of
Yeah. Honest or political answer? Yeah. So let me give you this book. Bill Walsh, there was a time when the 49ers did something special. He had to go into a team and kind of fire a bunch of the cancers who were the best players, like all Pro Bowlers on the team. And this book is like one of the best on understanding like the mechanics of the attention to detail, the power that it has in a team. During that era, he would have other players on NFL teams who would want to come to his summer camp because of how he ran them. So it's a book that I think is special and good. The reality was your co-founding relationships are really, really hard. I believe that the single biggest reason for failure in your startup is co-founder relationships or founding relationships, even if you're a single founder and you have a founding team. Some people would say, well, no, it's not. It's your ability to raise money. And I would say, yeah, and your ability to raise money, for me, is based on what I see between y'all, which translates itself into traction in the business and other things. But I mean, we watch that so closely. We can sniff out when there's struggle, and there's always some struggle. We had some struggle. We randomly early on selected amongst us a CEO, and then it turns out that person, that wasn't the right fit. And so then we my co-founders were brothers too. So we had dynamics of family, we had dynamics of this three-headed monster, and we were fortunate in that we stuck together. Most of our early employees would tell you, they're like, I don't know what you guys did all day, but all I heard was screaming from that room. It was like a lot of heat. We're all type A's. We all want the ball. Like, literally we all played basketball and we all just like always want to take the shot. And that became crippling for us. When we saw Ann, we were smart enough to be like, that's it. Like, that's just it. I think we all were, I don't know exactly why, but we were all raised in a way too that we knew when we could step aside, still sort of, give our all and bring all of our horsepower into a scenario, but realize when there was somebody else who could be accretive. And so that's a long way of saying, when we saw that our ability to lead this company, the role of a CEO is a special role. It's so important. And when we saw that we effectively didn't have any CEO by virtue of this three-headed founder monster, we knew that something had to give or this thing would break. Yep. Yeah. Yeah. So we didn't give as much thought as maybe we should have early days to revenue. So I'll talk about that. This is another Seth Godin, Tribes. I really like this. You will find, in your career, and I'm going to show you guys in a minute, like tribes play a big part, how they form and who they are to these circles of people that we can have a strong bond and connection with. We went into it knowing that there was a massive pain point. What we didn't know is how to make money. So I remember in 2006, that summer, we knew we had something. It resonated. We hadn't launched yet, but we felt that we would be successful. And so we went to the biggest industry conference for our industry. It was in Pittsburgh. I can see myself staying in the cheap motel with my co-founders. I think we all shared a bed. Every time we traveled, we shared a bed because we just didn't have money. And we went in there as sponges. So we had our notebooks, notepads. We went through the exhibit hall, every booth, understood what they did, and we're asking these questions. So how do you make money? What do you guys do? And they were just, who are you? We're like, oh, we're just college students, not a lie. And so we're gleaning all this information. We're attending every single session we can. We look over. These big industry events are sessions all day long all over the place when it's a big one. So we're attending everything. So I was learning. I can tell you now. I remember them talking about the decline of men or boys in college, the rise in the need to meet the needs of the LGBT community, some of these other understanding liberal arts education, funding, the funding for public schools and how you recruit a more diverse student body that pays higher tuition type stuff, all these themes. And so we come back after that to our hotel or motel room and in the subsequent weeks, and we're just whiteboarding all of this, here's buckets of gold. People are paying for this, people are paying for that. So what we stumbled on, for example, was that schools like MIT have no problem getting applications. We all know MIT, we've heard of it. But guess who they get problems getting applications from? Guess. Who would you guess MIT struggles to recruit? A little louder. Minorities. Yeah, specifically African American women from the South. They had a hard time. They didn't have any of them. So we're if we had a website that had a lot of kids, could we target African American women from the South who had an interest in engineering and say, hey, have you ever thought of MIT? And maybe they just think it's out of reach. Maybe I don't know. Maybe they haven't heard of it. So we started because of that to find where the money was. But initially we didn't. We just said this is a pain point. What you often find is that some pain point translates to some bucket of gold. Somebody's paying for that. Initially we thought maybe students, but then it's how much discretionary income do you guys have? Unless you're from Southern California and you have a little coin from the parents every month, which no offense if you do, and I really mean that. I got to be careful with that. I didn't grow up that way, so sometimes it's easy to throw a dart, but I'm not. But most of us don't have a lot of discretionary income. So we found, well, who else is paying? Oh, schools are paying. Which schools? Is it the state schools? Some of them. No, it's schools like BYU. It's private schools because they usually have big, other pockets of capital. I've started to learn about endowments and how those work. And so it was just this process of kind of stumbling from one thing to the next. How much time do we have so I can gauge the rest of this? Awesome. And we don't have to get through all the slides. I appreciate the questions. Next slide. So what I wanted to tack onto this too was, well, unbeknownst to me at the time, this team that helped build Zinch, Ryan Caldwell, Jeremy Johnson, Mick Hagan, Ann Duane, David Blake, Levi King, these people in the moment, you kind of realize the relationship is important. What you don't know is that the student next to you right now, the student that you're noodling on that idea for the project, I've had this happen, the student that for a school assignment, worked on a project together, a year later, 5 years later, 10 years later, all of a sudden, they're doing different things, and these circles and these orbits start intersecting one another at a greater frequency. Next slide, or transition of slide. These guys had also sold their company to Chegg. Their names are Aaron and Rob. They live in Pasadena, and I just funded their deal 6 months ago. It's awesome business. We'll 10x the business this month, knock on wood, or this year. So all these other people, it turns out in the years since then, our early angel investor, he's founded a company called Nav. You might have heard of it. Cake, we're launching tomorrow. Check it out, Cake browser. It's awesome. Degreed, you probably heard of it. They have they're amazing. They have half of their team, including engineers, are women. So when you talk gender diversity in a place, if I was a woman, that I'd be excited and attracted to work, Degreed's, just not to mention a phenomenal business. Village, so Ann is now a VC. So guess what? We share deals all the time. We were talking at Sundance at our founder conference. I'm like, Ann, what are you looking at? She's like, what are you looking at? Mick is in London working on mainframe. I met with his partner Brad, his brother, just this morning. Andela, Jeremy's in New York City, and he's leveraging all the talent that is nascent in Nigeria, huge population of people, limited supply of opportunities with the massive needs in the United States for engineers. So he's like, well, why don't we just build a place that we train engineers full time, and then they work for American companies. And so he has this company, Andela, which just raised $50 million from the largest African fund. Before that, they raised from people like Omid Yar. I can't think of all the people in the deal. A lot of well-known VCs. MX is a company you probably heard of too. Ryan Caldwell worked with us in the early days. And I mentioned Aaron and Rob. We got to know each other after our companies were acquired by Chegg, and we were sitting around the table, and you sort of get to know each other on a personal level. I find that they're super competent guys, and so years later, we stay in touch. We're skiing together, and they're like, hey, we're working on this startup, and I'm like, give me a look, and 6 months ago, we funded the deal. You have no idea whether your startup succeeds or fails, what will come of putting your heart into other people and building alongside them. What I can tell you is it happens. It happens by the double handfuls. And to this day, like, I don't discount this conversation where one of you might have a connection. You might look me up, you might connect with me on LinkedIn, you might reach out to my assistant, we might grab a bite to eat, and I'm going to treat you like I should, which is as close to a peer. Like, we're not that different. Like, I was sitting there too. I'm nothing special. I'm not that smart. I work hard just like you. But, you know, in saying I'm not that special, like, we all have something special, you know, and not to sound cliche, but, you know, when you bring those orbits, you know, and they start to hit each other and something special happens between two people with something in them, like, it's awesome. And I just see this all the time in what I do today. Next slide. So let's get to the next chunk. Wholehearted risk requires not taking oneself too seriously. I learned this so well from a mentor of mine. I'll be with him this week in New York City. His name is Dan Rosenzweig. Dan was the CEO of a company, Guitar Hero. If you ever played that, you're probably too young now. It was cool when I was younger. Do you guys even know Guitar Hero? Okay, you know Guitar Hero. I feel old. He was the COO at Yahoo. He made the investment, and you're like, Yahoo? But he made the investment in Alibaba. So then you're like, oh, that's interesting. Which is like all of their market cap right now. He was the CEO of Chegg, and he was the one who, with the founder of Chegg, spoke to me and Ann when we were talking about selling the company. He painted for us the vision of, you know, we think you're very accretive to our business. We're in the business of doing textbook rentals at the time for college students. Now they do much more, and they've kind of changed their business a bit. We think you can be a great part of this, and in 2 years we want to take this company public. And like, to a founder, it's like, I get to sell my company, a life-changing experience. I get to be a part of this cool new team. In this case, I was running China. We were launching in India and the Middle East. So I have kind of a cool gig that's appealing to something. I served my mission in Taiwan, so I speak a little Chinese, and it was like kind of my dream. And I'm working for this guy who has a story like mine. He was raised by his single mom. She was a school teacher. I was raised by a single mom. She was a school teacher. You know, he's just like works from the bottom rung to the top. Just so inspiring. So there were times when I saw Dan and his ability to command an audience and just authentically deliver something to a team where I would be a little intimidated. So I'm working on this presentation for how we're going to expand globally. And I have this deck put together. I've like looked over it a dozen times in PowerPoint, send it to him. We're talking on the phone. I couldn't be in San Francisco that day. And I go through it all, and then at the very end I have this thing that says my requests. And like the last one was Dan's blessing. And he's like, he goes through it, he's like, okay, he's like, my blessing. He's like, Sid, he's like, you're a Mormon, right? I go, yeah. And he goes, okay. How do Mormons give blessings? And I go, I'm thinking I don't think this is going to go well. I go, well, I don't know. He's like, no, tell me how a Mormon gives a blessing. He's like, I'm a Jew from New York. We have our rituals. You tell me yours. I'll tell you my secrets. You tell me yours. And I was like, well, it's not much of a secret, but we believe that power has been bestowed to man on earth. And he's like, okay, yeah, how do you give the blessing? I go, well, we put our hands on someone's head, and I kind of go on to explain this. And I feel a little weird after, and then he says, Ann, take a picture of this. And then he says, Sid, look at your phone. Next slide. And there's this picture on my phone of Dan blessing the phone. You know, he's like, Sid, here's your blessing. I've given you a Mormon blessing. You're good to go. And it was so good. It taught me something so powerful in that moment. I was like, you know, you cannot take yourself too seriously in all of this. Dan, I am with him literally this week. I'm taking my wife to see Hamilton. She's wanted to see it. I saw it without her. I got in trouble. She's like, we're going. Spending a ridiculous amount of money on these tickets, but we're going to New York. We're going to see Hamilton with some friends, and I'm meeting with Dan. because Dan, like to this day, like this little act among all the things he's ever done, like just endeared me to him. Next slide. So not only, and this slide didn't work well, I created this initially, I think, in Keynote. I'm not a PowerPoint guy anymore. But if you can transition it, not only do not take oneself too serious, but even taking others too seriously. I think sometimes, especially with our faith, it's easy to expect too much and to realize like we're all quirky, we're all figuring it out, and people of different faiths. I remember I was on a plane from the Middle East one time home, and I was sitting next to this Muslim gentleman, and at the end of the conversation, it's a long conversation, because it's like a long flight. I'm like, I have this distinct impression he is a better Mormon than I am. Like this, Islam, yes, but he's a better Mormon than I am. So we are not that different. And you'll find that what you learn here and what you take into the world, or what you take into our backyard here as you build startups or do whatever you do here in Utah, it's good to remember that we're all kind of the same cloth. And I appreciate that lesson from Dan. A couple questions, and then let's bust through the last little bit. And then you. Yeah, both of you. Yeah. No, you're good. I mean, look, if you're talking to me, like, this is my work attire, Now, that said, the other side of our business, so I run the venture practice, my partners run the real estate practice, they're all in suits every day. I mean, so there is something, and that's just how you dress, but, you have to gauge your audience is the simple answer. Like, you need to understand and do your homework before. Like, when I go to New York, I always forget how underdressed I'm going to be if I don't think about it, and that even matters to me. Like I'm not above putting a suit on, and I like to wear a suit too. But in terms of taking yourself too seriously, I think it's more about authenticity. So I'm talking about casual or formal, but really it's not that. It's you being authentic. Like in any role, like we're all looking for people where it's like, let's get past the formalities, let's get to the heart of it. Like, let's put our devices aside for a minute and just let our forces connect, because, that's what this existence is about. This is the only book I haven't read. It's like my #1 book to read because I've had so many people I respect tell me about it. It's Principles by Ray Dalio. I have no idea what it's about. But I bought it and I was like, if I'm geeked to read this, I'm sure you can learn something from it. Oh, right here, and then we'll go one more right there. So, right there, yes. What do you mean? How do I judge that? There's a few things. Like when we're looking at a deal together, Scott and I, we'll look at it and we'll say stuff like, does he have any skin? Does she or he have any skin in the game? If you've put in some of your own money in the deal, so our startup, me and my co-founder each put in $60,000 and the other borrowed $40,000. That was money from other startups that I had saved. Like I didn't spend a thing. When I started making some money in my first startup, it was like we still dumpster dive for our couches. My wife would patch them up. We still love shopping, and to this day, my wife loves going to Savers. There are some things we indulge in. Shoes for me, but we, what it meant to us. That money, I couldn't lose that. That was a lot of money. It is a lot of money. So we look for things like that. We look for. You'll see when people are hedging by other things. Sometimes somebody's working at a company and they're like, I'm working this on the side. It's really cool. And I'm like, when are you ready to cut? Really pull the zip cord on the thing. And so you just have to kind of, look at it aside from just sort of reading into somebody's soul. You have to see practically what are you giving up for something greater, right? This is Start With Why. So great. Simon Sinek is awesome. If you watch any of his YouTube stuff too, it is like one of those things where you're like, there is a lot of truth in there that we capture in places that we all search for truth, and he certainly is another echoer of truth. Yeah. Oh, cool. Yes. So the biggest deal that I missed, so entrepreneur, I'm the type of guy who remembers what he missed. Speaking of kind of sports analogies, Phil Knight, I love this book. That book is even better if you go there and then you go to the Beaverton employee store, which is when I finished the book, and then get suckered into buying $2,000 of shoes, which happened. So I know the deals that have gone well, but what really I kind of remember the most of the deals I missed. So the first deal I missed, my network in China is decent. I lived in Beijing for a while, and I still am there every single year. I love China. So there was a deal and an entrepreneur that was introduced to me, and they were like, it's a great opportunity, it's a huge market, you can invest at a 20 million valuation in their seed round. And that seemed like a crazy valuation. I don't want to get lost in that seemed an expensive price to pay for ownership into the company, and so I passed. They raised money a year and a half later at a 1 billion valuation from Sequoia, which is a good name in my industry. They've backed iconic companies that we all benefit from. So what was your question? I got off on a tangent. Yeah, I have, and it's a lot the same. In many ways, what you find the biggest difference is that culturally, China has a different context. Imagine a world, was the case, so I'm talking to my employees in Beijing, I had 50, and I take one of them out with her mom to dinner one night, and I'm like, so you lived through the Cultural Revolution. So one, it's like my peers, their parents lived through the Cultural Revolution. And that sounds dramatic, and it is dramatic. So I'm like, tell me what that was like. She's like, I was living in Beijing, I was 12 years old, and in the middle of the night, I'm woken up by my parents. If you're Chinese, who's Chinese, by the way, that's in here? Okay, so one, I want to give respect with how I'm talking about your country and the Cultural Revolution. To be very clear, I'm sharing this experience because it dramatically shares that was a big part of Chinese history. So in the middle of the night, she was woken up, left her parents in Beijing, moved to Inner Mongolia, imagine North Dakota, lived in a yurt, herded sheep for 9 years. Brought back after 9 years, so no running water, no whatever. Brought back after 9 years to her family in Beijing, and they never talked about it. So part of how their revolution worked, and we're a country that's also had revolution in our past, was different than ours. And the way information travels in China is different than our country. What I've learned in all that, the initial reaction was, oh my goodness, it's different, it's strange. What I've learned is it's different. It's different than my truth and my reality. They're just as human, they have a different context for building businesses. That impacts some of how they think of things like, for example, when you incorporate a company in the US, it's a straightforward process. Application, some fees, and you incorporate. In China, the way things happen doesn't reflect the same inherent trust in public institution that we have. In other words, if I get in a car wreck in China, it's not as straightforward as call the police, they'll figure out what happened. There's other factors at play. It's not right or wrong, I've learned. It's different. So if you're a Chinese entrepreneur, has all the same dreams, whatever, it's a different context they operate in, and those forces are factored into how their businesses grow or do not grow. That's what I would say. Thanks, good question. Let's jump 3 minutes. Okay, we're gonna just power through the last little bit. The only thing I would say is that, taking risks, transition slide, I thought it ended when you made a lot of money or you had an exit or some things. But what you find is, this is me and my partner when my hair was a little longer. This is me and Jeff, and Jeff I look up to. He's also an entrepreneur. He showed me that taking risks never ends. Next slide. And our vision when we got into what we're doing now was like not to go off into the sunset. It was like let's challenge ourselves, though there's different realities now. I don't feel like a burger from Wendy's doesn't taste as sweet as it used to. I remember when I was starting my first business, like the junior bacon cheese the dollar menu came out, Wendy's launched it, and that was like my lifesaver. And I remember how good a junior bacon cheese tasted. I go back now just for nostalgia's sake and buy one, and I'm like, this is so gross. Like, I don't like this anymore. So stuff is not quite as sweet in some senses, but it's it's just as sweet. So when I think about, transition to next slide, transition to one more. When I think about the businesses now that we get to see built, at first I kind of missed just that high highs and low lows of entrepreneurship, and then I found that I'm a part now of entrepreneurs taking a risk in their own right, and those kind of collectively give me a greater high than I've ever felt. And so That's a little bit of just kind of letting you know where I've come now, but one thing I have learned is to consistently put myself in uncomfortable situations continues to deliver euphoria that is worth it. Maybe one last question, even though I've got a few more books, and we'll wrap it up. Oh, we do. Let's do the other books upstairs. Thank you. I would say transition to the last slide. If you want to get in touch, please. Twitter's not the best thing. I don't even use the thing. Sid at peakventures.vc. If I can ever be of help to you, please reach out. I'm happy to find a time. Really appreciate your time. Thank you so much.